We get the gang traveling to an old military base that had been abandoned for some time, as Ben had been told by one of his contacts that something strange had been going on out there, and had opted to go in with his armor just to be on the safe side, as they said that there was strange activity beyond just that of aliens, and they'd all gone to check it out, finding holes in the walls. Kevin asked why they'd left ship behind, to which Ben states that if the other aliens are steering clear, then it's not something he wanted Ship to get involved with yet, being so young. And so his mother was watching over them instead, with Gwen saying that was a good call because there's no telling what this place holds. While investigating, they see that everything seemed to be fossilized, and they took notice of some trail that had been seemingly burned into the ground, with the trails going over to an old phone booth that looked like the slate it was on had been turned to stand, and the trails going into a police station, then to what looked like an apartment building. Whatever was going on, it seemed they were trying to do something specific. They see the strange creature that was leaving the trails, and Ben put his helmet on, saying that they had a feeling the armor would be useful, with Kevin absorbing the road, making a coating out of it, but the creature avoided them and went around accidentally rubbing its shoulder up against one of the buildings, causing it to fall on them. Kevin groans as they see that the creature was gone, and Gwen says that they should check the library to see if there was anything useful left out there, and that maybe there'd be something useful. While checking, they say that most of the viewer devices were busted and simply wouldn't work, but they found one that barely was still functional enough that they could make out what was on the slide, seeing names and things blocked out while reading information about some sort of experiment, while reading the information on the scientist involved. They hear rattling and see something move, with Ben going over, grabbing the person and lifting them up. The man he'd lifted looked like a scientist from the records that they were just reading, and the man says the armor really brought him back. Or was it forwards? Then asked Ben if they'd met yet, calling him by his first name, with Kevin looking confused about the situation and Ben telling them to talk. They ask who the guy was, but he says his name slipped his mind several hundred years ago, sadly. Then asked if they'd seen a space-time anomaly about yay high, while holding up his hand to around his shoulder in height. When they all look at him confused, he says that he must have been thinking of another moment instead, then proceeds to walk off down a hallway, though when they tried to chase after him, he was gone. Looking around, Gwen spots him outside leaning against a pole casually, as if waiting for them to notice. Though they chased after him, the man walked behind the rather thin pole, vanishing from sight, confusing them even more. The man continued vanishing and reappearing, with Kevin asking how he's moving away so fast, but the man then says that it's called walking, perhaps you should try it sometime, before walking behind another pole and vanishing again. Ben activates his plumber's staff while watching around and waiting, trying to study the guy's movements, though they were seemingly random and confusing. However, Ben then hurled the staff seemingly at a random direction and struck the man, knocking him down in the process, though he then stands up and says thank you for that because they'd busted up some of the buildings and it would attract them. They take notice of the creature from earlier running, and Kevin says that he finally has something to hit while absorbing Ben's armor. But the man tries to warn him not to. Still, Kevin does so anyway and tries to punch them, and unlike in the show, this redirects their path, causing them to try running as Kevin's armor coating began to age, showing wear and tear, cracking apart on his arm and falling off, though thankfully he didn't age in the process. Kevin says they should find that paradox theory guy, and the others nod in agreement, though Ben tells Gwen that she'd best get airborne in case that thing comes back. If it could age the armor that easily, there's no telling what else it could do. And so she takes off into the air and calls out that she sees the paradox guy leading the way to where he was waiting for them. The paradox guy says that they were supposed to be there 12 seconds ago, and then asked why Kevin hasn't been aged to that of an old man. Though confused, Ben says it's probably because of the metal of his armor, as Kevin had used it to make an armor coating of his own. And Paradox looks confused by that, looking between the three of them, then slaps himself on the forehead, seeing Gwen's blue eyes, going, "Ah yes, my apologies, it's been so long, I'd forgotten about this timeline's anomaly," confusing them. Gwen asks, "Anomaly?" not understanding what exactly he'd meant by that, and the man apologizes to them, introducing himself as Professor Paradox, then begins to explain everything to them, from his experiments, when he'd gone insane and started learning, and everything else that we got from the show, with them ending up on the moon and Paradox talking to another version of himself. They all travel back to the base, and Ben tells Paradox that he's got an idea, but they needed to go back to the point in time where the experiment took place. Though Paradox says that they mustn't stop the experiment, Ben tells them they weren't going to, with the creature coming to chase after them and slamming into Paradox, who tried to hold the creature back. Ben yells for Paradox to send them back now, and so they all teleport back in time to when the experiment took place, with him telling Paradox to keep the creature there, and went to the base waiting for the right moment, watching as Past Paradox then began to activate the experiment. Once Past Paradox had been sucked into the event horizon, Ben changed into Humongosaur and grabbed Paradox's assistant, pulling them away from the experiment, with Gwen then blasting the quartz crystal to bits, causing the experiment to shut down, and changing the anomaly into Paradox's assistant, Hugo, with Paradox slapping himself on the head, sighing that he should have remembered that as often as it happened. Ben and his group came running out, calling out to Paradox to get them back to their actual time, now. And so he does, as the military people all look incredibly confused by what was going on exactly. And once back in the future, a much older Hugo greeted them, and Paradox asked how his life was. To which Hugo says that he'd lived a good life, but wanted to apologize because he'd bumped the controls that messed up the experiment. Paradox then asked if he'd still like to time travel, to which his old assistant says that he's not afraid anymore, and so the two left together, with Ben, Gwen, and Kevin all heading off back over to Kevin's car to head on back to Bellwood. There was a note left on Kevin's car that said they should try to live a normal life for the rest of the week and make the most of it, because the next was going to be filled with danger.